Nobody search team on that mountain believes a man with no radio and no title can succeed, where 400 trained professionals already failed. They are wrong. For 4 days the Cascade foothills outside Leavenworth swallow every trace of Yelena Petrovna Volkov, and for 4 days half the world refuses to look away from a story that keeps changing its ending. Her private jet drops off radar 11 minutes after a routine call to air traffic control, somewhere over a ridge with no name on any commercial chart. And by the second morning, the search has already become the most expensive private rescue operation in state history. Helicopters burn through fuel faster than crews can refill them. Search dogs lose her scent under 3 inches of early snow. 400 trained volunteers walk the same slope so many times that their boots wear matching paths into rock that had never known a footprint before that week. When the incident commander finally changes the language in his morning briefing from recovery effort to remains recovery, only one man in the entire operation refuses to accept the shift, and he is not even part of the operation at all. Marcus Delane Whitfield lives 11 miles outside the official search perimeter. In a cabin he built with his own hands on land his grandfather cleared 60 years earlier, and he does not believe what the incident commander believes. A broken branch bent at an angle no wind could explain, a patch of disturbed lichen on a boulder 2 ridges past the last confirmed debris marker, a thread of wood smoke too faint for any drone to register, rising for exactly 4 seconds before the wind erased it. These are the things that send him walking in the opposite direction from every official grid line, carrying a pack he packed alone toward a woman he has never met and has no evidence is still breathing. The mountains around Leavenworth do not forgive carelessness, and every search and rescue coordinator who has worked that region for more than a season knows it in their bones. Temperatures at 7,000 feet fall without warning once the sun drops behind the western ridgeline, and a person caught without shelter after dark faces a slow, quiet kind of danger that has nothing to do with drama and everything to do with simple physics, the mathematics of a body losing heat faster than it can produce it. The commanders understand this better than anyone, which is precisely why on the morning of the 4th day, the official language shifts from urgency to procedure, and 380 volunteers who have hiked themselves raw over 4 days are told to stand down and go home to their families. Nobody blames them for it. The statistics leave almost no room left for hope past 96 hours in that terrain, and every person inside the command tent has worked enough of these operations to know exactly how the story usually ends. What none of them account for is a 44-year-old former Army combat medic who has never once in his adult life trusted a probability chart over the evidence sitting directly in front of him, and who is, at that very moment, quietly loading a pack 40 minutes outside the official perimeter while the rest of the operation prepares to give up. The county sheriff had announced to a bank of cameras that morning that hope was no longer a strategy his department could responsibly fund, a sentence that would follow him for years afterward, long after the true ending of this story made the front page instead. Yelena Petrovna Volkov built an empire out of skincare formulas and a face the fashion industry once could not stop photographing, and she runs both the way she has run everything else in her adult life, with spreadsheets instead of instinct and contracts instead of trust. She is 34 years old, the founder and majority shareholder of Volkova Beauty International, and widely regarded as one of the wealthiest self-made women to come out of Eastern Europe in the last 2 decades. That week she has flown a small chartered jet from Seattle toward a mountain retreat, where she intends to finalize a licensing deal worth $412 million, a deal that would triple her company's distribution across North America inside 18 months. The flight is supposed to take 51 minutes. Investigators will later note that her pilot filed a clean route, that visibility at takeoff had been rated acceptable by 2 separate weather services, and that nothing in the morning forecast suggested the sudden downdraft that struck the aircraft somewhere above a canyon that does not appear on any recreational map. The transponder blinks out at 9:14 in the morning, and with it goes every certainty the world holds about where Yelena Petrovna Volkov is and whether she is still alive at all. She had built her career on the belief that any problem could be solved if enough discipline was applied to it correctly, a philosophy that carried her from a 17-year-old runway model with nothing but a suitcase and a visa to the founder of a $900 million beauty conglomerate before she turned 30. Colleagues who respect her call it discipline. Colleagues who fear her call it something closer to ruthlessness. though almost none of them ever say so where she might hear it. She trusts financial models over gut feeling, trusts non-disclosure agreements over friendship, and has built her entire adult identity around the conviction that emotion is simply a variable other people have failed to properly control for. It is that same instinct for control that had scheduled the mountain flight against her chief operating officer's mild objection in the first place. A calculated risk weighed against a deal too valuable to postpone. And it is the sudden, total absence of control in that downdraft that will eventually teach her more about herself than any boardroom in Manhattan or Milan ever managed to. The disappearance becomes a global story within hours. Entertainment networks and financial networks fight for the same footage. Shares of Volkova Beauty International fall 11% on the first trading day and keep sliding as the search stretches into its second, third, and fourth mornings without a confirmed sign of wreckage. The Federal Aviation Administration opens an inquiry. State police mobilize every available unit in 3 counties. Search coordinators bring in thermal imaging drones, trained cadaver dogs, and enough volunteers to fill a small stadium, and none of it produces anything but false alarms, cold trails, and a search map in the command tent slowly filling with red lines through sectors judged impossible to survive. 11 miles from that command tent, Marcus Whitfield is splitting firewood and paying no attention to any of it. He has not owned a television in 6 years, does not carry a phone with reliable signal, and has built his entire life around a kind of quiet most people find unsettling, and he has come to find necessary. His wife, Danielle Whitfield, died 4 winters earlier on a stretch of black ice outside Wenatchee, and after her funeral he resigned from his job managing a regional logistics warehouse and moved himself and his 9-year-old daughter, Nia, out to the land his grandfather had homesteaded, choosing pine trees and hard physical work over a life that had started to feel like it was performed for people who no longer mattered to him. Marcus Delane Whitfield is black, 44 years old, 6'2", with a scar running along his left forearm from a roadside device outside Kandahar that he does not talk about unless someone asks twice. He raises Nia alone on savings that shrink a little more every month, a small veteran's disability payment, and whatever cash he can earn guiding backcountry hunting trips for clients who can afford the $1,100 weekly rate. His dream is small and specific. Pay off the last $4,000 on the cabin. Keep Nia in the good elementary school 40 minutes down the mountain. Never again have to explain to a caseworker why a single black father with no steady paycheck should be allowed to keep raising his own daughter without supervision. That last fear is not abstract. 6 weeks before the crash, Nia's maternal grandmother, Carol Ann Reyes, had filed papers questioning his guardianship, citing his income, his isolation, and what the filing called an unstable living situation, though anyone who actually visited the cabin would have found a spotless kitchen, a homework schedule taped to the refrigerator, and a little girl who read 2 grade levels ahead of her class. Marcus has a hearing scheduled for the following month, and he has already spent $900 he does not have on a lawyer named Desmond Greer just to keep the conversation from becoming worse than it already is. Marcus had spent 11 years in the Army before any of that, 6 of them as a combat medic attached to a Ranger battalion, 2 deployments to Afghanistan that left him with the scar on his forearm, a bronze star he keeps in a drawer instead of on a wall, and a habit of counting exits in every room he enters that he has never quite managed to unlearn. When he came home the first time, he worked the warehouse floor for a regional logistics company outside Wenatchee for 6 years, worked his way up to shift supervisor, and married Danielle Reyes, a nurse he had met at a veteran support group. 6 months after his final discharge papers came through, Nia was born 14 months later, and for a while, Marcus tells almost no one, life had looked exactly like the life he thought he had earned. The morning after Danielle's funeral, Marcus drove to the warehouse, handed in his badge and his keys, and told his supervisor he would not be coming back, not because he could no longer do the job, but because he could no longer do the job while pretending that a spreadsheet and a shift schedule meant anything at all next to the fact that his daughter no longer had a mother. He sold the house in town for enough to clear the mortgage and put a down payment on nothing at all, since the 11 acres out past the ridge had belonged to his grandfather, Otis Whitfield, free and clear since 1962, and Marcus spent the better part of a year building the cabin himself, board by board, teaching Nia to hammer and nail straight, before she had learned to write in cursive. 3 weeks before the crash, Marcus had driven Nia 40 minutes down the mountain for the school's fall fundraiser night, a folding table carnival held in the gymnasium where parents were asked to sponsor a $25 raffle basket if they were able. He had brought cash, careful and counted, and stood near the back of the gym in his one clean flannel shirt, while Principal Denise Farrow, addressing a cluster of parents that included a hedge fund manager and his wife, made a joke to the group about families who show up to these things without a checkbook, glancing just briefly in Marcus's direction as she said it. Nobody in the circle laughed loudly. Nobody needed to. Nia, 9 years old and sharper than any of them gave her credit for, had heard it too, and had gone quiet for the entire drive home, finally asking her father in the dark of the truck cab whether they were poor. Marcus had told her that they were rich, in every way that mattered, and broke in exactly one way that did not, and he had believed it when he said it, though it had cost him something to say it steady. He had not slept much that night, lying awake doing the same arithmetic he always did in the dark, the guiding fees against the propane bill, against the retainer, against the $4,000 still owed on the cabin, and had gotten up before dawn to split wood he did not yet need, because his hands had always understood how to carry what his mind could not put down. Money is not abstract in that cabin. Marcus keeps a ledger in a spiral notebook on the kitchen counter, tracking every dollar that comes in from guiding hunting parties and every dollar that goes out for propane, for Nia's shoes, for the $1,100 retainer he had scraped together for Desmond Grier. Some months the number in that ledger frightens him more than anything he had carried through Kandahar, and he has learned to fold that fear small enough to fit in his chest without Nia ever seeing it on his face. He has been turned down for a small business loan twice at the bank in town, once by a loan officer who glanced at his address, his income, and the color of his skin, in that order, and told him the risk profile simply did not work, though the white contractor 2 names down the same ledger, with half Marcus's savings and none of his discipline, had been approved the same week. Walter Okafor, an old friend from Marcus's years doing seasonal work for the Forest Service, drives up the gravel road on the afternoon of the 3rd day to ask if Marcus has noticed anything strange in the woods. Marcus straightens from his work, wipes his hands on his jeans, and looks toward the tree line before answering. He tells Walter that if the search teams are following a printed map, they will never find her, because the mountain does not care what any map says. Walter does not fully understand the remark and does not press him to explain it. He drives back down the gravel road, and the cabin goes quiet again. 2 mornings earlier, before any of that, Marcus had driven his truck down to the command tent himself, the same way any other local with backcountry knowledge might, and tried to tell the operations officer, a clipped, impatient man named Todd Rasmussen, about the wind pattern in the Western Canyon and the way the debris cone did not match a straight vertical fall. Rasmussen had barely looked up from his tablet. He told Marcus that the search was being run by trained professionals using verified data, thanked him for his concern, and suggested he go home and let the state handle it. The same sentence, Marcus would later realize, that Rasmussen had probably never once used on the retired airline pilot and the hedge fund executive who had also shown up that morning offering their own theories and been waved toward the volunteer sign-in sheet instead of the door. A deputy near the tent entrance had asked Marcus for identification before he was even allowed to finish his sentence, then asked him a second time 10 minutes later when a different officer walked past. As though the first answer had not been sufficient, and Marcus had stood there in the cold morning air, a decorated combat medic with 2 decades of terrain experience, being treated like a trespasser on a search for a woman he had not yet even met. He had driven home that afternoon telling himself it did not matter, that he did not need Rasmussen's permission to walk his own mountain. And he had spent the rest of that day marking up his own hand-drawn map at the kitchen table, the same map that would eventually lead him to the crevice where Yelena lay dying, a map no one in that command tent had ever bothered to look at. That night, as the temperature drops and the wind shifts hard out of the northwest, Marcus steps outside to check the woodpile and stops entirely still. A flock of crows lifts all at once from a valley that has been silent for years, scattering upward in a panic that has nothing to do with weather. He watches them for a long moment, reading the shape of their flight the way another man might read a sentence, and something in the pattern tells him that whatever startled them is not an animal and is not the wind. Without a word to anyone, because there is no one left awake to tell, and because Nia is asleep at her grandmother's house for a scheduled overnight visit that he has fought hard to keep amicable, he fills a canvas pack with rope, a trauma kit, and a headlamp, and walks out into the dark toward the one stretch of terrain every official search team has already crossed off as impossible. He does not follow the wide logging road the rescue teams have been using, the easy switchbacks built for trucks and stretchers. Instead, he cuts west into terrain with no name on any topographic chart, guided by things a satellite cannot measure. He studies the direction of the wind funneling through the canyon, notices how the creek runs colder and higher than it should for the season, and traces a line of broken branches that curve unnaturally against the slope, as though something heavy had come down through the trees rather than crashing straight into the ground. A jet falling under normal conditions leaves a debris field that spreads in a predictable cone, and every official map had been drawn around that assumption. But Marcus has spent 2 decades learning that mountains rarely behave the way assumptions demand, and if the aircraft had been forced down at an angle along that particular ridge, the wreckage would not be anywhere near the sectors the search teams have already exhausted 3 times over. While 380 volunteers pack up their equipment and pull back from the higher elevations as darkness falls, Marcus keeps climbing. Rain turns to drizzle, and drizzle thickens into fog that presses close against the trees, cutting visibility to a few dozen feet in any direction. He moves carefully, testing each foothold before trusting his weight to it, aware that a broken ankle out here would be its own kind of death sentence, and aware that Nia is 9 years old and cannot lose a second parent to a mountain that does not know her name. An hour into the fog, he finds a shard of curved acrylic wedged into the bark of a fir tree, still sharp enough to cut his glove when he picks it up. A few steps further, dark spots on a flat stone already thinned by the rain. Then, caught in a tangle of exposed roots, a woman's wristwatch, far too expensive for anyone who has ever set foot on this ridge, its crystal face cracked, but its hands still moving. He turns it over in his palm, feeling the weight of confirmation settle into his chest, and pushes on into the fog with a renewed certainty that he is close, even though there is still no sign of the woman herself. He catalogues each object the way he had once catalogued evidence overseas, noting the direction it came to rest, the way the moss beneath the watch has been disturbed only recently, the absence of any drag marks that might suggest an animal carrying it there instead. Nothing about the scene matches the debris field the official searchers map 2 ridges over, and the further he climbs, the more convinced he becomes that the entire operation has been anchored to a false assumption from its very first hour, one small early error compounding itself over 4 days until it steered 400 trained searchers entirely away from where a dying woman actually lies. Earlier that same evening, before he had ever set foot past the tree line, Marcus had stopped at a diner in town to buy a thermos of coffee for the walk, still dressed in his field jacket, with a topographic map folded under one arm, and the hostess, a young woman who did not recognize him from anywhere but the color of his skin and the state of his boots, had asked him twice whether he intended to pay before he ordered, glancing toward the register the way people glance at something they expect to have to chase down later. He had paid in exact change, left without the coffee, and driven the rest of the way to the trailhead with the particular, familiar tiredness of a man who had spent his whole life proving the same unnecessary thing to people who would never once have to prove it to him. Sometime after midnight, in the stillness between one gust of wind and the next, he hears something that does not belong to the forest. A faint, rhythmic tapping, almost swallowed by the rain, a sound like knuckles or a stone striking rock, in a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. He stands motionless, straining to place its direction, and when it comes again he is already moving toward it before he has consciously decided to. The sky has only just begun to gray with the first suggestion of morning when Marcus finally traces the sound to its source, beneath a shelf of broken rock hidden from every angle a search helicopter could have flown. He finds a narrow crevice where the mountain had folded in on itself long before any road existed, and wedged into that crevice, wrapped in the torn remains of a flight jacket, shivering so hard her teeth have stopped chattering, is Yelena Petrovna Volkov. Her face is pale beneath a layer of dried blood, one leg twisted at an angle that tells him to break before she says a single word, and her lips have gone the color of the fog around them. She looks up at him with eyes that have already begun to lose focus, and in a voice barely above a whisper, in an accent worn soft by 15 years in America but never fully gone, she asks if he is with the rescue team. Marcus kneels beside her, checking her pulse against her throat, and answers with one word. "No," he says, and begins working the straps of his pack loose to reach the emergency blanket inside. He does not ask her name. He does not yet know who she is, and in that moment it does not matter to him at all. He splints her leg with a length of branch and strips torn from his own shirt, forces water past her cracked lips, a few careful sips at a time, and when he judges her stable enough to move, lifts her onto his back in a fireman's carry his body still remembers from 100 old training exercises, and begins the long descent toward his cabin, the only shelter he trusts within reach. Neither of them speaks much during that walk. She drifts in and out of consciousness against his shoulder, and he keeps his focus locked on the ground ahead, choosing each step with the same care he had used to find her. What he does not see, and what she is too far gone to notice, is the glint of sunlight catching off a lens far down the valley, where a pair of binoculars tracks their slow progress through the trees with an attention that has nothing to do with rescue. By the time they reach the cabin, the sun has fully risen, spilling pale light across the clearing, and the woodpile Marcus had been mending only a day earlier, a lifetime ago, by the feel of it. He lays Yelena on the narrow bed in the back room, builds up the fire, and cleans the wound on her leg with the same steady hands he had used to splint it in the field. She wakes slowly, her eyes focusing first on the low wooden ceiling, and then on the man moving quietly beside her, and for a long moment says nothing at all, as though trying to decide whether she has actually survived or simply dreamed of survival. When she finally speaks, her voice is stronger, though it still carries the rasp of 4 days without proper water. She tells him the aircraft had not simply fallen out of the sky, that she had felt something detonate beneath the cabin floor of the plane, a jolt too sharp and too localized to be a downdraft, seconds before the pilot lost control entirely. It had not felt like an accident, she says, and she has spent every hour since telling herself she was wrong, because the alternative was too dangerous to consider while lying broken in a crevice with no way to defend herself. Marcus listens without interrupting, his expression giving away nothing, though inside his mind he is already running back through everything he had seen on the mountain, the strange angle of the broken branches, the debris pattern that made no sense for simple mechanical failure. He had spent enough years reading terrain and reading people to recognize when a story does not add up, and hers, paired with what his own eyes had already told him, does not add up at all. He does not share his suspicions yet, choosing instead to focus on getting fluids into her system and checking the splint for swelling. Outside, as evening approaches, he notices headlights sweeping briefly along the tree line at the bottom of his access road, far earlier than any patrol he expects, and far too quiet for an official vehicle. He says nothing to Yelena about it, but he moves the rifle from its case above the door within easier reach, and he does not sit with his back to the window again. Later that night, as the fire burns low and Yelena sleeps fitfully in the next room, a knock lands on the cabin door. 3 deliberate strikes, carrying none of the urgency a real rescue team would bring. 3 men stand on the porch when Marcus opens the door, dressed in gear that looks correct at a glance but wrong on closer inspection. Jackets a shade too clean for anyone who has spent 4 days in these woods, boots without a scuff of real mileage on them. They introduce themselves as an independent contractor team assisting the official search, and say they have reason to believe the missing woman is somewhere in this sector. Marcus keeps his body angled in the doorway, blocking the view into the cabin, and studies them the way he had once studied smugglers overseas who claimed to be lost farmers. The lead man's eyes drift past Marcus's shoulder toward the faint light spilling from the back room, and in that instant, Marcus understands exactly what kind of men have come to his door. He tells them calmly he has seen nothing, that his cabin sits too far from the search corridor to matter, and suggests they try the ranger station 6 miles east. The moment the latch clicks shut behind them, he moves fast, waking Yelena with a hand over her mouth to keep her silent, guiding her toward a trapdoor beneath the kitchen floorboards that leads to an old root-cellar tunnel his grandfather had dug decades earlier for reasons long forgotten. As they descend into the narrow dark, the sound of glass breaking echoes from somewhere above them, followed almost immediately by the unmistakable crackle of flame catching dry wood. By the time they emerge from the tunnel's far end into the cold night air, Marcus's cabin, the only home he has built since Danielle's death, the home where he had taped Nia's homework schedule to the refrigerator that very week, is already burning against the black tree line behind them. They move through the forest in silence for nearly an hour, Yelena leaning heavily on Marcus's shoulder, her splinted leg dragging with every other step, until he judges them far enough from the fire's glow to risk a rest. An old fire lookout tower, abandoned for at least a decade, stands tucked into a stand of lodgepole pine a mile further up the ridge, its windows boarded but its structure sound enough to shelter them until dawn. Inside, wrapped in a dust-covered blanket he finds folded in a supply closet, Yelena finally tells him the rest of what she has been carrying since the plane first shuddered beneath her. A licensing restructuring worth hundreds of millions of dollars had been quietly moving through her company's board for months, a deal that would consolidate voting control on a small circle of shareholders if she were no longer able to cast her own shares. Her death, or her permanent incapacitation, stood to benefit that circle more than almost anyone else on Earth. And in the confusion of a genuine tragedy, no one would think to look twice at how conveniently timed it had all been. She tells him about a general counsel named Bradley Hensford who had drafted the restructuring documents himself, about a chief financial officer, Anton Dravik, who had liquidated a suspicious number of personal holdings 3 weeks before her flight, and about how she had spent the last several years surrounded by people whose loyalty she had never fully trusted, sitting in that cold, abandoned tower, admitting for the first time in years that she does not know a single person left in her professional life she is certain would not profit from her disappearance. Marcus listens the way he listens to the forest, without interrupting, letting her reach the end of her own thought before he offers anything back. After a long while he reaches into his pack and withdraws a small twisted piece of metal he had pulled from the wreckage site before ever finding her, scorched black along one edge, in a pattern no simple mechanical failure would produce. He had recognized it immediately for what it was, evidence of a deliberate charge rather than an accident, but he had said nothing until now, wanting to be certain before handing her a truth that would change everything. He tells her, too, about the business card he had found tucked into the lining of the flight jacket while cleaning the wound on her leg back at the cabin, a card bearing the logo of a private aviation maintenance company Marcus had never heard of, with a name handwritten on the back in blue ink that meant nothing to him but visibly meant something to her the instant he says it aloud. Yelena's breath catches. The name belongs to a contractor her own maintenance team had flagged and quietly dropped 18 months earlier over a billing irregularity, a contractor she had personally approved, reinstating 6 weeks before the flight, after Hensford brought her a memo insisting the original concerns had been a clerical error. She had signed that memo without reading past the summary page. The only time in 15 years, she tells Marcus, that she can remember trusting someone else's word over her own judgment, and it is the detail that finally convinces her the sabotage had not been opportunistic at all, but planned months in advance by someone inside her own house. When he places it in her palm, Yelena goes perfectly still, staring at the fragment as though it were a piece of her own body rather than a scrap of destroyed machinery, and for the first time since the crash, the color drains entirely from her face. She asks him, once she finds her voice again, why a man with his obvious skill lives so completely alone, so far from anyone who might need saving. Marcus does not answer right away, choosing his words the way he chooses his footing on unstable ground. He tells her about Danielle, about the ice on that highway outside Wenatchee, and about the custody papers waiting for him back down the mountain, the hearing that could take his daughter away from him for the crime of raising her without enough money in the bank. Yelena studies his face while he speaks, and something in her expression shifts, the practiced skepticism she brings to every boardroom giving way to something quieter and more genuine. She has spent her entire adult life surrounded by men who wanted something from her fortune, her image, or her name, and here in a burned-out lookout tower on the edge of nowhere sits a man who had risked his life to save her before he even knew who she was, and who wants nothing from her at all. Near dawn, a satellite phone Marcus carries in his emergency kit finally catches a signal strong enough to hold, chirping to life with a burst of static that startles them both awake from the light doze they had fallen into. He uses it to relay a coded message to Walter back at the ranger station, describing their location in terms only another guide would understand, careful not to broadcast anything a scanner could easily decode. But even a brief signal leaves a trace. And less than 20 minutes later, the same 3 men who had burned his cabin appear at the tree line below the lookout tower, moving with the coordinated pace of people who had triangulated a position rather than stumbled onto one by luck. Marcus understands immediately that the tower offers no real defense, only a clear line of sight for whoever controls the ground beneath it, and that their only real advantage now lies in the same terrain that had already saved Yelena's life once. He leads her down the back slope of the ridge, away from the direction their pursuers expect, choosing a route through a narrow defile where loose scree makes pursuit slow and noisy for anyone unfamiliar with the ground. Yelena, despite the pain radiating up from her splinted leg, keeps pace as best she can, gripping a walking stick Marcus had cut for her from a fallen branch, and somewhere in that grueling descent, she stops thinking of him as a stranger who happened to find her and starts understanding him as the only steady thing left in her world. The forest around them changes character as the elevation drops, the tight stands of lodgepole pine giving way to older growth, trunks wide enough that 2 people could stand behind one and disappear entirely from view. Marcus uses that cover instinctively, weaving their path from trunk to trunk rather than crossing open ground, reading the slope ahead for the places where fallen timber and boulder fields will slow anyone chasing them who does not know the ground as intimately as he does. Yelena finds herself watching his shoulders rather than the trail itself, matching her pace to the rhythm of his movement, and somewhere in that long, aching descent, she notices that fear has quietly stopped controlling her breathing. It is not that the danger has lessened, it is that she has, for the first time in longer than she can remember, placed her survival entirely in someone else's hands and found that her body no longer fights the decision. They cross a shallow stream where the cold water numbs her leg enough to dull the pain temporarily, climb along a narrow ledge above a rock slide Marcus knows from memory rather than any map, and finally reach a hidden game trail that winds behind a waterfall few people even know exists. He does not carry a firearm with any real stopping power, and he does not need one, because every choice he makes in that landscape is itself a kind of weapon, built from 2 decades of understanding what the mountain will and will not forgive. Behind them, the pursuit grows louder and more frantic as the 3 men realize how badly the terrain is working against them, voices carrying oaths and instructions across the ravine, that the wind occasionally twists back toward Marcus and Yelena, giving away just enough of their position to stay one step ahead. Yelena watches Marcus navigate each obstacle with a calm that has nothing to do with recklessness and everything to do with earned confidence. And somewhere in the exhaustion of that flight, she finds herself thinking that all the wealth and power she has spent her life accumulating had never once given her the kind of security she feels walking behind this quiet man through a forest trying to kill her. As the eastern sky begins to lighten with the first true colors of morning, the two of them break from the tree line into a wide alpine meadow. And there, cutting low across the ridge, comes the unmistakable shape of a rescue helicopter running its official search pattern. The first real search aircraft either of them has seen since the crash. Marcus pulls a flare from his pack and fires it skyward without hesitation, watching the red trail arc above the meadow, and for a moment relief floods through both of them at the sight of the helicopter banking hard toward their position. The relief lasts only seconds. Behind them, breaking from the same tree line they had just escaped, the three armed men emerge into the open meadow, weapons finally drawn without pretense, closing the distance with the desperate urgency of people who understand that daylight and witnesses mean the end of everything they had been sent to accomplish. What follows happens faster than either of them can fully process in the moment, though every detail of it will later be picked apart in painstaking testimony. Marcus pulls Yelena down behind a fallen log at the meadow's edge, as the helicopter spotlight sweeps the open ground, catching the armed men fully illuminated in a wash of white light. State police, alerted by Walter's relay hours earlier, arrive on the ground almost simultaneously, moving in from the access road with weapons raised and orders shouted across the open meadow. The confrontation ends without a single shot fired, the three men surrendering the instant they understand the helicopter above them is broadcasting live to a command post that already has federal agents standing by. The lead investigator on scene tells Marcus and the state police captain that they have roughly 6 hours before the three suspects are due to make contact with whoever had hired them, based on a burner phone recovered from one man's jacket, and that whatever evidence exists needs to reach federal hands before that window closes, or the trail back to Hensford and Dravik could go cold for good. It is Marcus who remembers the business card tucked in the flight jacket lining, still folded inside his own pack, and it is that single card, handed across a folding table in a mobile command unit at 11:40 that morning, that gives investigators the maintenance contractor's name 6 hours before the deadline the lead investigator had feared they would miss. Within the hour, Marcus hands over the scorched fragment of metal he had carried through 2 days of pursuit, along with a clear, unhurried account of everything he had seen on the mountain, and by that afternoon, federal investigators have already begun tracing the fragment back to a supplier with financial ties to Bradley Hensford and Anton Dravik, the two men Yelena had named in the lookout tower before dawn. Bank records subpoenaed within 72 hours show a wire transfer of $218,000 from a shell account linked to Dravik's brother-in-law to a private aviation maintenance contractor 11 days before the flight, a payment neither man is able to explain to investigators. A second transfer, smaller and sloppier, shows $9,400 moving from the same shell account to a shared personal expense account belonging to Bradley Hensford 3 days after the crash, a payment prosecutors will later argue in court was nothing more than a bonus for a job both men believed, wrongly, had already been finished. Federal prosecutors ultimately charge both men under conspiracy statutes, carrying a combined maximum of 35 years, and neither man's defense team is ever able to explain away the timing of that second transfer to a jury's satisfaction. Before any of that gratitude reaches him, Marcus spends nearly 6 hours inside a state police field office being questioned as a person of interest rather than treated as the man who had just saved a billionaire's life. An investigator named Gerald Fenwick, working off nothing more than the fact that Marcus had been alone in the woods with no witnesses for the better part of 2 days, asks him 3 separate times to account for his whereabouts during the exact window the aircraft's transponder went dark, as though a man who had built a career reading terrain for a living needed to explain why he happened to be good at his job. It is only when Yelena, still hooked to an 4 line in the next building, demands through hospital staff that someone bring her the name of the man currently being held for questioning, and confirms under oath that Marcus Whitfield had arrived carrying a scorched fragment of evidence rather than planting it, that Fenwick finally releases him without charge, offering an apology so brief and so procedural that it barely qualifies as one at all. The story that breaks across every news outlet that evening bears almost no resemblance to the one the world had expected. The woman, everyone believed dead, had not been found by an elite tactical team or a state-of-the-art rescue unit, but by a single black father living at the edge of the search perimeter with no phone, no television, and no interest in the fortune or fame his discovery would bring him. Reporters descend on the small mountain county within hours, hungry for interviews, offering him sums of money that would have startled him years earlier, back when money still meant something more to him than paper. He declines every one of them, not out of stubbornness, but because he genuinely cannot understand what value there is in narrating an act that, to him, had simply been the obvious thing to do. What the reporters find instead is a smaller, uglier story circulating through the county sheriff's office, one that never makes the evening broadcast. Before Marcus had even reached the hospital with Yelena, a deputy named Russ Calloway had detained him at a roadblock for 22 minutes, demanding proof he was not one of the 3 armed suspects, despite the state police radio already confirming his identity as the civilian who had located the missing woman. Marcus stood in the cold with his hands visible, answering the same 3 questions 4 separate times, while Yelena, drifting in and out of consciousness in the back of an ambulance 40 feet away, kept asking where he had gone. It is Yelena herself, once she is stable enough to speak to the incident commander, who insists the deputy's name be entered into the official incident report, and who later ensures the county's oversight board reviews the stop as part of its formal record. Yelena refuses every press conference the hospital's public relations team tries to arrange, insisting instead that she needs to see the man who saved her before she says a single word to anyone else. When she finally has herself discharged against medical advice and driven up the long gravel road to where his cabin had stood, she finds only ash and a scorched foundation, and pinned beneath a stone at the edge of the clearing, a single folded sheet of paper in Marcus's careful handwriting, saying only that he needed time, and that she should not look for him the way everyone else had once looked for her. Weeks pass before Yelena learns, through Walter and a quiet network of old Forest Service contacts, that Marcus has taken temporary work rebuilding trail shelters in a national forest 2 counties over, choosing physical labor and solitude the way he always had whenever the world pressed in too close, and that Naya is staying with a cousin in Ellensburg while the custody hearing waits on the calendar. Yelena does not send investigators after him, and does not use her considerable resources to track him down the way she might have tracked down anyone else who owed her something. Instead, she waits, allowing him the same patience he had shown her in that burned-out lookout tower. There is one thing she does not wait on. Within 9 days of leaving the hospital, Yelena personally funds Marcus's legal defense in the guardianship matter, retaining one of the state's most respected family law attorneys, a woman named Priscilla Nkemdiram Adiemi, and submitting a sworn statement to the family court, describing in exact detail the judgment, composure, and care Marcus had shown under conditions that would have broken most trained professionals. Carol Ann Reyes withdraws the petition 3 weeks later, and the judge closes the file without a single day of testimony required, restoring full, uncontested guardianship to Marcus Whitfield. When enough time has passed that it no longer feels like an intrusion, Yelena drives herself out to the small ranger district office where Marcus has been staying, without an assistant, without security, and without a single camera trailing behind her. She finds him exactly as she had imagined she would, high on a ladder repairing the roof of a trail shelter, sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the late autumn cold, entirely unaware of the car pulling into the gravel lot below. When he climbs down and sees her standing there, he does not seem surprised so much as quietly unsurprised, as though some part of him had expected this exact moment to arrive eventually, once she had healed enough to come looking on her own terms rather than anyone else's. She tells him that the entire world had searched for her with helicopters and satellites, and every resource money could summon, and none of it had found her at all. Only he had found her, she says, using nothing but patience, judgment, and a kind of attention the rest of the world had forgotten how to give another human being. Marcus allows himself a small, tired smile, the first genuine one she had seen from him since the mountain, and tells her that the forest never lied to anyone willing to actually listen to it, unlike almost everything else in her old life. She laughs at that, a short, surprised sound that seems to catch her as much as it catches him, and admits she cannot remember the last time something made her laugh without calculation behind it. Before either of them says another word, Yelena reaches into her coat and hands him an envelope, plain and unmarked, and tells him it is not payment, because she knows better than to insult him with payment, but a standing scholarship fund established that morning at the county's community college in the name of Otis Whitfield, his grandfather, open to any student in the district raising a sibling or a child of their own while enrolled, fully funded for the next 20 years regardless of what happens between the two of them personally. Marcus reads the letter twice, folds it carefully, and says nothing for a long moment, because there are some kindnesses too large to answer with words right away, and Yelena, watching him, understands that silence better than any thank you she might have gotten from someone else. He offers her a cup of coffee, poured from a battered percolator that has clearly seen better decades, and she takes it without complaint, sitting on an overturned crate, because the small office has no proper furniture for guests, feeling more at ease in that plain, unheated room than she had ever felt in any of the marble lobbies that carried her name. They speak for a long while that morning, not about the crash or the men who had chased them, but about smaller things, the way the light moves differently through pine forests, depending on the season, the names of birds she has never bothered to learn, the particular quiet of a place with no schedule pressing against it. In the weeks that follow, the conspiracy inside Volkova Beauty International unravels with the same discipline Yelena had once reserved for her balance sheets. Bradley Hensford resigns within days of the federal indictment and is later sentenced to 9 years for conspiracy and attempted murder. Anton Dravik's assets are frozen pending trial, and the company's board, once packed with allies loyal to the restructuring scheme, is entirely replaced within 4 months. Through a shareholder vote, Yelena wins with 83% support. The stock, which had cratered to $19 a share during the 4th day of the search, recovers to a new high of $61 a share within 7 months, once the market understands exactly whose hands had actually been steering the company all along. Yelena announces the creation of a new wilderness search and rescue foundation, funded personally with an initial gift of $22 million rather than routed through her corporation, dedicated to training search teams in the same terrain-based methods that had saved her life when every piece of modern technology had failed her first. She asks Marcus to serve as the foundation's lead training consultant, not as a figurehead for publicity, but as the actual architect of its curriculum, and after several days of quiet consideration, he agrees, not for the salary the position would have paid him, since he refuses most of it, but because the idea of other lost people being found the way he had found her matters to him in a way very little has mattered since Danielle's death. Word of what actually happened on that mountain spreads far beyond the county line, told and retold, until it settles into something close to local legend, the story of a quiet black father who walked out into a storm everyone else had already surrendered to, and came back with the one thing an entire nation's resources had failed to find. Yelena makes certain, quietly and without announcement, that his privacy stays protected even as her own life returns to a version of the public eye she had once taken for granted, and she personally funds a formal review inside the county sheriff's department that leads to a written policy change governing how deputies verify identity at emergency roadblocks. A change the department credits directly to the 22 minutes Marcus spent standing in the cold, answering the same question 4 times. 1 year later, on the anniversary of the crash, the Volkova Whitfield Wilderness Foundation, renamed by unanimous board vote to honor both of their contributions, reports that it has trained 340 search and rescue volunteers across 4 states, that its terrain-first methodology has been directly credited with locating 11 lost hikers, who would likely not have survived another night under the old protocols, and that it has awarded 62 full scholarships to young people from rural and working-class families pursuing degrees in emergency medicine, forestry, and wilderness science, including a full scholarship quietly set up in Danielle Whitfield's name for students who are also raising siblings or children of their own while in school. Nia Whitfield, now 10, spends her weekends learning to identify bird calls and read a topographic map from the same man who once did the same for a generation of park rangers, and on the evenings when Yelena drives up to visit the new cabin Marcus has begun building not far from where the old one had burned, the three of them sit together and watch the light change over the ridge. And Nia has started calling her, without anyone asking her to, by a nickname that makes Yelena's eyes go bright every single time she hears it. Principal Denise Farrow, who had once made a quiet joke about families without checkbooks, stands at the following year's fall fundraiser and personally introduces the new Otis Whitfield Family Scholarship to a gymnasium full of parents, without ever quite meeting Marcus's eyes while she does it, and Nia, sitting in the front row in a donated blazer 2 sizes too big, leans over to her father and whispers that she thinks the principal finally learned something, and Marcus tells her that people can learn given enough time and enough proof standing right in front of them. The community itself changes in smaller, quieter ways that never make the news at all. The bank that had twice denied Marcus a small business loan extends him a line of credit within the year, unprompted, once his name becomes attached to a foundation with assets in the tens of millions. An irony Marcus mentions to Walter exactly once and never brings up again, choosing instead to open a modest outdoor equipment shop in town that hires 2 local teenagers who remind him, in ways he does not say out loud, of the boy he used to be before the army and before the mountain taught him everything else. The Volkova Whitfield Wilderness Foundation breaks ground 18 months after the crash on a permanent training campus a half-mile from where Marcus's original cabin once stood, built partly from salvaged timber pulled from the burned foundation itself. And the ribbon cutting draws 41 search and rescue agencies from across the country, along with a short unscheduled visit from Todd Rasmussen, who asks almost sheepishly whether the foundation might have room for one more volunteer instructor. Marcus says yes, the way the mountain had once taught him to say yes to almost anything worth doing without needing to be asked twice. Rasmussen spends that first season learning, slowly and without complaint, the same lesson Marcus had tried to hand him for free 2 years earlier at a folding table in a command tent. That a map is only ever a summary of what the land once looked like, and that the people who survive are, more often than anyone in a command tent wants to admit, found by someone willing to trust their own eyes over a printed line. What grew between Marcus and Yelena in the months after the mountain was never the kind of romance either of them had known before. No declarations, no rush toward anything neither was ready for, only a steady, patient trust built one quiet morning at a time. Yelena, for her part, learned to sit in meetings again without the old armor she had once needed, discovering that honesty offered plainly and without calculation tends to earn far more loyalty than fear ever had. Marcus spends his weeks training young rescue volunteers the same way he had once trained himself, walking them through forests at dawn, teaching them to notice broken branches and disturbed moss, and the particular silence that falls over a valley when something has gone wrong within it. 2 years after the crash, the Foundation publishes its first full impact report. It lists 340 trained volunteers grown to 912 across 7 states, 11 confirmed rescues grown to 29, a partnership with 4 state search and rescue agencies that have formally adopted the terrain-first protocol as a supplement to thermal and satellite methods, and an average reduction in large-scale search operation length of 9 hours per incident, according to independent data compiled by the participating agencies themselves. Rasmussen, the operations officer who had once waved Marcus toward the volunteer sign-in sheet, sits through an entire 2-day training session taught by Marcus the following spring, and shakes his hand afterward without a word of apology. Though the handshake itself, Marcus tells Walter privately, Is apology enough for a man like that? Todd Rasmussen is not the only figure from that week whose fortunes shift. Bradley Hensford, once general counsel and a man who had signed off on restructuring documents worth $412 million, loses his law license permanently and is ordered to pay $18 million in restitution on top of his federal sentence. Anton Dravik pleads guilty to conspiracy and wire fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence and testimony against 2 remaining board members, and his wife files for divorce 4 months after his indictment, citing in her own filing the $218,000 wire transfer that had first cracked the case wide open. Deputy Russ Calloway is reassigned to administrative duty pending the Sheriff's Department review and resigns 8 months later rather than complete a retraining program the county now requires of every officer working large-scale emergency operations. A man who once had to fight in family court to prove he deserved to raise his own daughter now stands in front of state governors and federal search coordinators, teaching them methods that have already saved 11 lives that the old system would have written off as unrecoverable. A woman who once could not name a single person in her professional life she trusted completely with her own survival now keeps taped to the inside of her office door in a headquarters she rebuilt from the ground up a single photograph of a lookout tower on a ridge in the Cascades, and beneath it, in her own handwriting, 4 words that no one else in that building has ever been given permission to ask about. Danielle Whitfield's name is etched now into a small bronze plaque outside the new training campus, not because Yelena needed to compete with a memory, but because she understood, in a way very few people in Marcus's life ever had, that honoring what came before him was the only way to truly stand beside him now. Nia keeps a photograph of her mother on her nightstand next to a small framed photograph of the lookout tower where her father had once carried a stranger to safety, and some nights she asks Marcus questions about both women, and he answers every single one because silence, he has learned, is only useful when it protects someone, never when it simply hides something they deserve to know. There is a kind of justice that comes from a courtroom, and there is a kind of justice that comes from a mountain simply refusing to hide what one patient, disciplined man was willing to walk through the dark to find. Marcus Whitfield never set out to prove anything to anyone. He walked into that storm because a flock of birds told him something the entire search command had missed, and because somewhere underneath the quiet grief he had been carrying for 4 winters, he still believed that if a person is out there needing to be found, someone has to be willing to go and find them, whether the world is watching or not. What would you have walked through, in the middle of a night with no map and no guarantee, for a stranger you owed nothing? How much of the good in this world goes unrecorded simply because the person doing it never once asked to be seen? If a story like this reminded you that quiet, disciplined love still exists in places the cameras never look, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that good fathers and good people are still out there walking through the dark for each other. Tell us in the comments which moment in this story stayed with you the longest, and if you believe a man like Marcus Whitfield deserves every bit of the peace he finally found, let us know before you go.